Have you ever wondered what businesses are doing and should be doing to tackle climate change? Then check out the award-winning and chart-topping podcast, Climate Rising, produced by Harvard Business School and hosted by me, Professor Mike Toffel. Recently named one of the best environmental podcasts by Earth.org, Climate Rising shares a behind-the-scenes look at how some of the world's top entrepreneurs and business leaders are addressing climate change, from climate storytelling and marketing to AI, regenerative agriculture, and beyond. Don't miss out. Follow and listen to Climate Rising wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, it's Akshat. There is now a ceasefire agreement between US, Israel, and Iran for 2 weeks starting Tuesday. This week's episode, which was recorded before the ceasefire announcement, looks at the long-term impacts that the war will likely have on the energy system. Even if traffic of oil and gas ships from the Strait of Hormuz restarts, the effect on energy markets and policies will play out over months and years. Welcome to Zero. I'm Akshat Rathi. This week, the big energy pivot. When the US and Israel attacked Iran on February 28th, energy markets panicked, but not a lot. There was an expectation that even though Iran was attacking ships in the Persian Gulf and had effectively stopped traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, that things will calm down and the ships carrying 20% of the world's oil and gas will be back on the job. Thousands of people have been killed and dozens of ships have been attacked. When I wrote Climate Capitalism, which documented the solutions the world has deployed at scale to cut emissions, the stories typically had two major pivot points: the oil crises of the 1970s and the Paris Agreement of 2015. If a book about climate solutions is written in 2050, I think there will be a third pivot point: the energy crises of the 2020s. So today I want to look at the kinds of long-term changes that happen from energy shocks. The 1973 and 1979 oil crises happened in short succession. It mostly affected rich countries that were prodigious consumers of imported oil from the Middle East. Those countries shifted their consumption of oil in power plants to natural gas and nuclear. Major oil companies launched solar businesses and invested in energy research, which led to the invention of the lithium-ion battery. And the International Energy Agency was born, creating the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to try and avoid such price shocks. There were also a slew of energy efficiency measures that were taken, including the Americans buying more efficient Japanese cars. The 2022 energy shock hit Europe the most, but many gas-importing countries also recoiled at the sky-high prices of natural gas. The current shock is much bigger. It's both oil and gas, and it is bigger for countries in Asia and Oceania particularly. That means we are no doubt going to see long-term changes, says Bloomberg opinion columnist David Fickling. I look forward to every column he writes, and right now particularly, his view on how the Asian energy market is going to evolve is very useful. I hope you enjoyed this broad-ranging conversation. David, welcome back to Zero.
Hey, thank you.
So let's start in your home country to understand the myriad ways in which the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is having an impact on the energy world. Australia is one of the world's largest fossil fuel producers, so you would kind of hope maybe that Australia actually gets away more lightly in this energy shock than other countries. But Australia doesn't have much of its own oil, and so it really relies on imports. And you wrote a column about the country's diesel imports, and some of the numbers in there were really shocking. That for a country that is less than 30 million people, Australia is one of the world's biggest importers of diesel. It consumes more diesel per capita than any other country in the world. 80% more diesel than US per capita, which, really does consume a lot of oil, and 8 times as much as China. So why did Australia get hooked on diesel?
It's fascinating. I was actually taking a long road trip. I live in Sydney, and I was taking a road trip up to Brisbane which funnily enough was like my first long EV car trip. It's about 900 kilometers. It's a 9-hour drive. A lot of the time, the only other vehicles on the road with me are just these enormous, technically we don't call them road trains, we call them B-doubles in Australia. It's a big truck with 2 trailers behind it. Further out in Australia, they can be with 3 trailers behind them or even 4 trailers behind them. But these are immense diesel-powered monsters, as big as you'll see sort of anywhere else. And there's just a constant stream of them going up and down the coast and going on all the big intercity routes. And that's just a small part of the pitch that you have in Australia. And I think part of it is really because of geography and the structure of the economy. In terms of geography, most journeys between major cities in Australia are a best part of 1,000-kilometre journey. So our rail system is quite underdeveloped, and the distances are not very suitable for freight rail. So a lot of that gets done with diesel. Our economy is very dependent on mining and agriculture, and mining machinery is all powered by diesel, and agriculture, farming machinery is generally powered by diesel. So all of those contribute to the fact that, as I say, 7.7 barrels of diesel per person per year get used in Australia, and it's sort of far more than any other country. Having said that, I think there's a crucial factor that you need to add to that, which is that we also subsidise diesel very heavily. It's one of the biggest spending programs that the government has. It's treated as essential to the economy because this is treated as a business input. If you're running a mine, one of your business inputs is diesel. So this, you get a rebate on what you spend. But the scale of it and the distortion of it is what makes it really striking. We spend more on the diesel rebate than we spend on the army, on the Air Force. We spend almost as much on the diesel rebate as we spend on public education. You really get the sense of the importance of that when you start talking to people who are using a lot of diesel and on paper would like to reduce their use of diesel. All the mining companies, they're obviously shying away from this now, but a few years ago they were very seriously looking into decarbonisation, and they were talking a lot about decarbonisation. But lots of fairly low-hanging fruit that exists elsewhere just doesn't really happen very much in Australia. There's a lot of sort of talk about tentatively having electric mining trucks and things like this, but they essentially had some studies of this, and most of them are not doing very much with this. You go to Chile, one of the biggest copper mines in the world, Collahuasi, has overhead lines, a little bit like tram lines, for hauling the ore out of the pit. And that's the standard way of doing it. If you go to Brazil, S11D, part of the biggest iron ore mine in the world, has a huge piece of electric mining equipment that mines and processes and crushes the ore inside the mine. And of course, actually, if you're a sort of nerd about electric vehicles, of course, the biggest electric vehicles ever built are actually in Germany. They're not a very net zero activity. They're in some of those enormous lignite mines in Germany, and they're all fully powered by electricity. So electric mining equipment is common elsewhere in the world, not in Australia. And I would argue part of the reason is that we subsidise diesel so aggressively that it doesn't make sense for miners to switch.
Those coal diggers in Germany are so enormous. I think they're like 5-story buildings that run on electric, just essentially taking tons and tons of earth with just one single swipe. But the point you're making here is also one that I think we know, but we don't really absorb, which is just how much policy matters in shaping our choices, especially energy choices. Let me give you the example of UK's diesel problem. So around 2002, there is a policy brought in to encourage people to buy more diesel cars than petrol cars, because at that time, there was the assumption that diesel was cleaner than petrol. And so even though the total volume of cars in the UK, diesel made up only 15-20% at that time, because of the incentives that were given, tax incentives that were given, the sale of diesel cars really rocketed. And by 2015, more diesel cars were being sold than petrol cars. And of course, we know Dieselgate happened, Volkswagen got caught in the scandal. We learned that actually it is not cleaner than petrol, and then diesel car sales plummeted. But heavy goods vehicles, UK doesn't have that much industry, but there are a lot of trucks. They continue to run diesel, and actually the consumption of diesel hasn't fallen off. And now, because of the way the country has been reconfiguring its refineries, etc., the UK is heavily dependent on importing diesel. About 60% of the diesel comes from the crude in the Middle East in some form or the other, direct or indirect. And so these policy choices really have a huge impact on the fuel dependency that is created as a result. But talk me through other examples in your part of the world where the diesel dependency is something that could really be walked away from, at least on the road vehicle level.
I think the most striking thing is actually what we saw happening last year in China. And this is, I think, not talked about nearly enough, but there's enormous potential there. And that's the scale of the electrification of heavy trucks. I remember going back, I think it would be about 8 or 9 years, when Elon Musk first unveiled the Tesla Semi, the electric semi truck. I was very skeptical about that. I wrote about it at the time, and I was very skeptical that the economics and the sort of battery weight elements of electrified truck are actually going to work very well. And I think I've been proved wrong about that.
And we know that it took Tesla 8 or 9 years to actually have the Semi on the road, because it's only last month that the first commercial Semi has been put on the road.
Indeed.
China, of course, got there sooner.
Well, yeah, China has got there so much sooner that actually in December, the number is astonishing to me. More than half of the heavy-duty trucks sold in China in December were electrified trucks. This is a number that just really sort of defies belief, to be honest. I mean, again, I remember writing about 2 years ago, there was at that point, compressed natural gas was actually seen as the sort of the thing that would take over large scale trucking. I was saying, well, that's actually going to damage diesel demand in Chinese trucks. But then batteries have really come from nowhere and saw this huge surge towards the end of last year. And a thing that you have to bear in mind about a lot of this trucking is a lot of the companies that are producing these electric trucks, companies like Sany Heavy and XCMG, they made a lot of money during China's construction boom. They're essentially they're construction machinery companies, and trucks are a sort of sideline. And of course, China's construction boom has comprehensively ground to a halt. The amount of new floor space built in January and February this year, we've only got the sort of first 2 months of the year, but it's the lowest since 2002, which was just a couple of months after China joined the WTO. We're talking about a completely different China. Now, these companies were built for that market, and they need a new market, and electrified trucking could be that.
But there is also diesel dependencies in developing countries where it is used for public transport. There are all these mini trucks running around in Africa that run on diesel. The Philippines, you've noted, has tried to switch to e-mobility, but it hasn't really worked. So what kind of policies would help developing countries to figure out how to cut their diesel dependency?
With a lot of those developing countries, it's a very thorny problem that involves, I think it involves a lot of the sort of subsidy structure, and it involves this sort of shift that you always notice in development between sort of CapEx and OpEx. OpEx is something that might be more expensive for you in the long term, but it's easy to do because you don't need a lot of money on hand to do it. You don't need to borrow a bunch of money. Whereas capital spending, you need to persuade someone to lend you some money. This is a problem that we see in the sort of low end of transport across the developing world. I was chatting to an expert today, actually, in the Philippines, where if you've been to the Philippines, you'd know their sort of iconic public transport is what's called a jeepney, which started after World War II with military jeeps getting converted into little buses with people on the flatbed truck. But they're all diesel powered. Most of them are diesel powered. They tend to be very, very old vehicles with sort of terrible pollution. Passengers don't really like going in them anymore. People would like to be in something more modern. And the Philippines really for the last 10 years has been trying to sort out the jeepney sector. To be honest, it's not gone as well as you might have hoped. There've been big strikes by drivers, because what sorting this out will involve is individual drivers getting turned into sort of big cooperatives, and then cooperatives borrowing a bunch of money, and then they can get electric jeepneys, and the drivers will get a wage, the drivers will get benefits. It'll be much more regularized as a sort of business, and people who have converted tend to be a bit happier about it. But the people who have not converted, they like they like running their own business. They like the independence context that makes sense for Australia and UK. They're a bit like Uber drivers. They have that sort of independence. They have the upside that you get if you have a good day of driving. The government wants to switch them to more something like a bus driver model, where you don't get any upside if there's more driving. And there's been a lot of resistance to that, and it has proved difficult.
One other way in which I've been thinking about this energy shock is, having lived through what happened after Russia attacked Ukraine here in Europe, it feels like that kind of energy shock is now really an Asian problem. In a way, this is Asia's Ukraine moment. It was mostly a gas crisis in Europe. Of course, there were other fossil fuels involved as well, because Europe imported a lot of diesel from Russia, some crude oil, but also a bunch of coal. But in Asia, this is going to be both an oil and gas crisis. Let's stick to oil and let's look at electric cars. We keep hearing that, yes, they are now lower in price. There's all this availability. Actually, there's a cool factor. We also see that in sales figures. Some of the Asian countries are now selling more electric cars as a proportion of new cars than many of the rich economies, better than the US, better than the UK, Vietnam, Thailand, Nepal. These countries come to mind. When you were thinking about the switch to EVs, how are you thinking this particular shock will affect EV sales in Asia?
I think this has been another of these emerging trends that, again, it was sort of emerging last year, and then this energy shock has come on top of it. And I think it could prove very dramatic. The numbers that we've seen in the last 6 months for some of these Asian markets are extraordinary. And the one little caveat I would add to them is that these markets tend to be quite driven by the fact that there have been some quite high tariffs on a lot of these vehicles, and the tariffs were sort of knocked off, and a lot of those tariff reductions were coming to an end at the end of last year. So a lot of people were rushing to buy cars in time for that. So that's probably distorted things a lot. But it's shown what you can actually achieve if you decide not to tax green energy, basically. And then, the numbers are extraordinary. Like 50% of cars sold in Thailand and Singapore in the last few months have been battery-only models, not just plug-ins, but battery-only, without an engine at all. About a third in China and Indonesia, South Korea and Vietnam, far ahead of numbers. I think the UK is about 20%, the US is about 8%, Japan's about 3%. The one that's actually notably lagging of the big economies is India, is also similar to Japan, is about 3%. India's on a very low level. But across Southeast Asia, really, there's been this really dramatic change. Thailand, EV cars are at price parity, which is still not quite the case in a lot of places that are not as exposed. I think that's not the case in the UK. Here in Australia, it is the case. EVs are pretty much at price parity. And certainly in China, EVs are cheaper. The thing that always holds people back is the sticker price. It's actually not the price of fuel. But obviously, the price of fuel is suddenly very much on everyone's mind at the moment. So I think that really does, that gives an opportunity for a much broader shift.
The tariff policy, you can argue, makes sense for some countries. Like in India, it probably makes sense because it has its own domestic car industry that it would very much like to protect, that has a number of people that are employed. For most countries, there isn't really an auto industry to protect. So what is the reason for those tariffs to exist, and what could be done to encourage countries to actually drop them?
I mean, a lot of these tariffs, to be clear, are in the countries that are protecting their car industries. But as you say, I mean, a crucial factor about a lot of these emerging markets where, to be clear, people's models about the future of oil demand all depend on the idea that these countries are going to buy petrol cars, not electric cars. If you don't have an incumbent car industry to protect, you just want to buy whatever the cheapest car is. And also, if I'm a government, I want the car that it does the best thing to my balance of payments. Because, of course, the other much bigger thing to consider is that the amount that you spend on imported cars in any one year is just dwarfed by the amount that you spend on imported petroleum. If you're not an oil producer, then the amount that you're spending on oil to fuel all those cars is many orders of magnitude, in most cases, greater than the amount that you're spending on cars. So it makes no sense, if you don't have your own car industry, to put a 50% tariff on cars when generally you don't have a tariff on the petrol. You're just blowing out your own balance of payments, basically.
There is also the psychology of what happens during an energy shock that sort of remains with people for much longer than what the numbers might always be able to capture. Talk to anybody in America who's lived through the 1970s and they'll talk about rationing of fuel, and there were all these long queues, and many vowed this will never happen again. That's why you got the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, etc. Well, we are already starting to see those kinds of queues across Asia now.
I was just going to say, I grew up in Britain, and I remember my parents telling me stories of the 4-day week in the 1970s, which was when this was fuel rationing at the time of the 73 oil crisis, and today, I'm talking to someone in the Philippines, and she's telling me about how everyone's working a 4-day week. This is something that happened before I was born, and it is a phrase that I remember from my childhood more than 50 years ago. And this is happening right now in Asia. I don't know if you ever saw the recent film. It was a great film, Licorice Pizza. It came out about 5 years ago. It's sort of set in Los Angeles in the 1970s. And there's this wonderful cameo scene of people basically having punch-ups in 1973 at gas stations in Los Angeles. And I was seeing these videos recently of punch-ups in India at retail sales of LPG for cooking gas. It's exactly the same thing. And this is, memories of a generation ago. The new memories are being made right now.
After the break, more of my conversation with David Fickling. And while I have you, please take a moment to rate or review Zero on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. It helps new listeners find the show. Recently, a reviewer wrote, "In a world with so much bad news, love that this podcast has some episodes of things that are going in a positive direction."
The news doesn't stop on the weekends.
Context changes constantly.
And now Bloomberg is the place to stay on top of it all.
Hi, I'm David Gura. Join us every Saturday and Sunday for the new